Good morning, good afternoon, good evening everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to another LIDNUG, Link.net Users Group online presentation. I hope you're having a good day wherever you are and whatever you're up to. Today we have Mitch Harpur from Wintellect doing practical patterns with JavaScript, ASP.NET MVC4 and HTML5. Just before we continue, as always, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Orcsweb, Telerik, Pluralsight and Syncfusion. We wouldn't be able to do any of what we do if it wasn't for these guys. Coming up on the 15th of this month, our good friend John Papa is back for, I believe, will be his 5th or even possibly 6th presentation with us, doing single page applications. So looking forward to that. That should be awesome as always. We have more in the pipeline. Keep an eye on our Eventbrite page for other events after that. As is usual, if you want to get in touch with us, it's info@lidnug.org, or you can follow us on twitter.com lidnug, Facebook lidnug, or our YouTube page, which is called lidnug. And finally, bit.ly.lidnug for our official site. I think that's all I've got. Oh, yes, during the course of this presentation, we will be picking a winner at random, and that winner will receive a Wintellect virtual training course worth $499. We'll pick that during the presentation and let you know if you are the lucky winner while the presentation is still ongoing. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you across to Mitch. And are you there, Mitch?
Yes, I am.
Take it away, my friend.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. As I have been so introduced, my name is Mitch Harpur. I am a senior consultant with Wintellect, and it's really just great to be here today. The sort of topic I want to talk about today is JavaScript patterns. So I'm hoping to strike a good conversational tone, and I hope that you will enjoy this time. I hope you'll learn something. I'm sure that many of you may know more than I on this subject. It's a journey. JavaScript is a journey, as many of you may have realized. But nevertheless, there are great things to learn in it and to learn from it. So just to sort of give you an overview of, let me just start this screen here. So, who are we? Wintellect. Well, Wintellect, we do lots of things. We love code. We're a very passionate group of people. We do consulting and training and designing and debugging. So you may have heard of Jeffrey Richter, Jeff Precise, and John Robbins. They're the founders of Wintellect. And they are uber geeks, wonderful people though. And we really do a lot of training and consulting and things like that. So we're always happy to help out with that. So what we're going to do today? Well, I think, to sort of set the stage, I've set it at 5 minutes. It may take a little bit longer than, but I want to dive in a little bit about JavaScript, because I think, when you speak of JavaScript, many people have a different reaction. Some people think it's some kind of a lightweight scripting language, not very powerful, which is not true, but nevertheless, that is the impression, right? And I think for some of us who've been around the block a little bit, you go back to the late, just before 2000, and you had people.
Can I just interrupt there a second, Mitch?
Yes.
Have you shared your desktop by any chance? Because everybody's saying if you have, we can't see anything.
I believe I did. So let me. How's that?
There we go. Thanks.
That would be helpful. Thank you. So let's reverse. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Mitch. So I just told you about what we do, and we're Wintellect. This is just a little information about us, just to sort of recap that. Again, just welcome again. Right. Starting again. So now everyone can see my desktop. If anyone can't, please yell with I am, and I will try and do that. Great. So what are we going to do? As I was saying, we're going to dive into JavaScript a bit. And to recap what I was saying, for for some of us who've been around the block a bit, when we started doing JavaScript, it was something that you write a couple of event handlers in an HTML file, and you do a couple of click handlers, and that's about it, right? And you do a lot of the stuff on the server in classic ASP. Then we had ASP.NET, and we got the web sort of exploded, and JavaScript sort of took a life of its own. But really, the last few years, JavaScript has become so widespread that people have been doing pretty amazing things with it. And so I hope to just point out some of those things and maybe change how you think about JavaScript, because JavaScript is extraordinarily powerful. And I think that if you think about it differently, you can really use it to your advantage. It's not a typed language, it's a dynamic language, which you all know about. But nevertheless, so I hope that I can teach you something and that you'll find something useful here. So some of the things I want to cover, just to sort of set that backdrop, is I want to talk a bit about scoping, about hoisting, and about functions. If you're a C# programmer or a C++ programmer or someone who's worked with a strongly typed language, the rules are different in a functional language. JavaScript is a functional language. Functions are first-class objects in JavaScript, so they've got some pretty powerful features, and if you're aware of them, you really can do some amazing things. So I want to talk a little bit about scoping, and scoping in the sense of when do JavaScript objects come into life? When do they die? How do I know the rules of when a JavaScript is around? Because traditionally, I guess a lot of us who work with JavaScript as globals, and globals are very bad things, at least for the most part. So scoping, I'll sort of delve into that, and what I'm going to do, as I said, to strike a conversational tone, I'm going to bring up a wonderful text editor called Sublime Text, and I'm just going to sort of type code on the fly as I talk through things, because I think I can sit here and talk, but it's not really going to mean anything until you actually see some code in front of you. So I'll do that, and I'm going to go through the presentation like that in this sort of way, and at the end we're going to sort of go through an actual visual. I'll bring up Visual Studio, and we'll actually apply some of these principles, because the goal of this is to be practical. Now, as far as HTML5 is concerned, I just want to emphasize that most of my emphasis is on patterns in JavaScript. HTML5 is a consumer of that. I'm not going to dig into super details, because HTML5, when you have a good basis for JavaScript, you can really leverage and take advantage of HTML5, because it's got really tremendous features. So that's not the total scope of this talk. The emphasis is more primarily on JavaScript. And then the third thing I want to talk about, obviously, again, is functions. And what are these functions? Functions are friends, in a real sort of strongly typed environment. Functions don't necessarily always take a first-class status. So I want you to just bear in mind. So let's delve into it. Some of the other things I want to delve into is some really useful stuff. And, you can use this stuff because it's helpful. There are libraries, as many of you found. There are many, many, many libraries out there to do all sorts of things. Some of them are useful, some of them are immature, some of them are mature. But I think it makes sense to use that stuff, because it's available. You're leveraging from someone else's mind share and how they've grown and learned. So I want to emphasize some of those things, and some features of jQuery I want to delve into a bit, specifically $deferred, which is really a very powerful abstraction and a great way to help when you're thinking up of patterns. I'm going to talk a little bit about Amplify, which is a pub/sub JavaScript library. I'm going to talk about Require.js, underscore. So I'm just going to bring some of these utilities in, because, what is patterns? Patterns is things that people have figured out that work, and common ways of doing things in applications. And usually it's quite easy to apply patterns. And when we think of patterns, we think of the traditional Gang of Four, right? And you go and you get your Gang of Four book, and you read all about patterns, about factories and facades and commands and so forth and so forth. Well, the truth is that you can do this stuff in JavaScript too. And you can do it easy and very powerfully. You just have to think about it differently. I always joke, because I always say, JavaScript is as easy as falling out a tree. You just got to let go. So it really depends on how you land that governs the level of pain that you're going to experience. So being able to really leverage the language is really important, and at the same time leverage tools out there so that we don't go around inventing the wheel. So that's just a sort of a key thing I'm going to delve into. So some useful things that we'll delve into. And then we'll write some more code as well. And that's pretty much the scope of what we're going to do. So I expect it to take some time. Now, I just want to bring to your attention as well, this is, I'm writing code on the fly here. So some things may be a little bumpy, but I think you'll find it useful and you'll find it helpful. All right, so let's go on. So the patterns which I probably will sort of touch in are things like a module, a factory, some statics, some singletons, some facades. Now, there are many more patterns given. I think these are just a set of patterns which, once you abstract and you see how they're used in an application, you'll find it useful and helpful. One of the big things that people I found struggle with in JavaScript is how to modularize code. How do I take JavaScript, which traditionally, right, you've got just several JavaScript files out there. How do you break them up in a logical way that makes sense and that is helpful? And so the module is really a great way to help facilitate. And some of the third-party libraries that I'll emphasize, which is Require.js, helps take advantage of this. And so it's really useful to know. The factory, the idea behind the factory, right, is it's a creational pattern. That means that, objects have lifetime, right? They come into being, they do stuff, and they die, right? And so patterns are a lot to do with, okay, so when do they come into play? How are they created? What do they do when they're living? And how do they die? When do they die? Those kinds of questions. So factory is really a nice one to help. So it covers the creation side of things. Statics, I guess I wouldn't much as call that as a pattern as more as a sort of a connection to C#. If you, I've done C++ and C#. When we think of a static method in C#, can you do things like that in JavaScript? Yeah, you can. You can. You just got to think about it, right? And you've got to adopt the right paradigm for it to make sense. Another thing I'll delve into is singleton. Singleton is a life cycle thing. How long is it going to be there? An instance, when I ask for an object, is it always going to give me the same instance of that object? And the facade is just, it's a bag to put stuff in and to hide things and to expose to the world. Think interfaces and things like that. So these things are possible in JavaScript, believe it or not. You can really do that. And I really encourage people to think this way with JavaScript because it will help make your applications modular and maintainable. So really a big deal. So let's just dive in. So I hope I've given a backdrop. I will repeat myself quite a bit, I guess. Some of it is deliberate, some of it is unintentional. Some of it, I guess, I'm just going nuts. So bear with me. So let's talk about scoping a bit. Right. So code. Let's have the code talk to us. Let's look at this variable at the top here. I've just got a JavaScript file. And I've declared a variable here called I am a global. Now, there's no containing scope. Let's just assume this is a file that was loaded in JavaScript. So this global is here, and this variable exists everywhere in the scope of the current code. So if you've got a web page and you've loaded some JavaScript files and you've declared a variable in this way, it's going to be everywhere. Now, in C#, you could put a little curly brace and you could declare a variable inside there. And if I asked you, what is the scope of that variable, you would tell me, well, when I exit the curly brace, that variable no longer exists. Well, in JavaScript, that's not true. You are still a global in the context of curly braces. Curly braces are not a scope-defining mechanism in JavaScript. There is only one scope-defining function, really, or mechanism in JavaScript, and that is function. So when we want to define a scope for a variable, you're going to think of using a function as opposed to a curly brace. And then whatever you define in that function, depending how you use it, will determine whether that variable lives or dies when the function exits. And this is a very important thing. I don't know if you've run into this problem before, right? So you're writing a JavaScript file and you declare a variable foo, and then you want to use foo somewhere else, but now you have to overwrite the old foo because it's a global variable, and you sort of have these sort of hunt for globals. You have this problem of redefining variables, and you know, good code says I want to name my variable according to its function. So it's really helpful to have that defined correctly so that you know when you're dealing with things. So the point I'm trying to make here is function scope. If I want to define a scope, I declare there, and I've got to use the var keyword. This is really important. I live in the scope of this function. So this variable lives in the scope of this function. Now, this variable, no freaking way, I am a global too. This guy is global because he doesn't have a var. And this is important to remember. You'll see tons of code mistakes happen this way, where people forget to define the variable correctly. Now, supposing I'm in a function and I declare curly braces. If I declare a variable here, all right, then it would be live in the scope of this. But the truth is this variable is also a global because he has no var. But if he had a var before it, he would actually live in the scope of the outer function. And I'm going to sort of go into some code now in a moment just to illustrate these points. But if you get your scoping right, if you get your paradigm to think about scoping right in JavaScript, it'll go a long way to helping you understand code that's out there. Because, I mean, I'm sure most of you know what it's like. You get a JavaScript file, and it's just hard to read sometimes. And I would also say, don't be embarrassed if you find JavaScript hard. It is hard. It's hard because it's dynamic. It's hard because it lets you do whatever you want. It lets someone else do whatever they want, and you live with the consequences of that. But the beauty of JavaScript is that it lets you do whatever you want. And so if you follow a couple of rules, you're going to go a long way. And I will say that JavaScript is so much more used now. I don't know if any of you have heard of Node.js. Node.js is actually JavaScript on the server side. And it's really amazing stuff. It's really good. JavaScript's really doing well. Basically, Node is Google's V8 JavaScript engine, hosted on a server side, so you can write server-side code in JavaScript and really have it fast. No, it's not as fast as raw, highly optimized HTTP handlers and stuff, depending on what you're doing those handlers, of course. But it's very, very efficient. At least, you know, it's just very fast. So another cool thing is, you know, I've got a function here, and I can have a function in a function. And the beautiful thing is, yes, I can do that. And if I declare variables in there, all the variables in this function have access to variables in the outer function. It's called kind of a closure, if you will. So let me just illustrate some of these points. So if you haven't used Sublime.txt, it's an awesome text editor. Hopefully you guys can all see this. I'm just going to create a new file. So, like I was saying, I declare a variable. Right, this is global. We know that. All right, now, let's say I define a function. Call it foo. This is my unit of, this is my namespace, if you will. If you want to think of it. You know, in C# you would do this, right? And, you know, this guy would be defined only in the namespace foo, all right? So if you want to think of that, so you've got to use functions to do that in Java. And someone will say, well, that doesn't make sense. I can use a function. Well, we'll kind of get into that, but there's ways of doing that really are helpful. But the bottom line is, if I have a local here, all right, the scope of that variable is there. Now, let me ask you something. Supposing I do this. Right, if I do that, and this is the column we're saying, let's say I did console. Someone may ask, well, where is that variable defined? What is the scope of this variable? So the way you answer that question, JavaScript, is not what is the closing brace, but what is the closing function? So the truth is I can access I can do that. And so that doesn't make sense in C#, but it makes sense in JavaScript, because what the JavaScript interpreter actually does is it takes, when this variable is declared, it automatically does this. And that's the thing. And this is a thing called hoisting. Hoisting means that all the variables that are defined in the scope of that function are hoisted to the top of the function declaration. And this is a very important thing to remember. And this also applies to this. Let's say, for example, I did this. Let's say I defined a function. I defined this nested function. Well, here's the cool thing, is I can actually invoke that here. So I know some of you, I'm sure some of you know that, but I bet you a lot of you didn't realize that, because you can't do that in C#. Because you have to have things defined before they're used, right? Well, remember, and the mechanism for doing that is hoisting. Now, what JavaScript internally does when it sees a function that's like this is it does this. There's a variable. I'm just kind of that moves the body of that function. That's the way JavaScript sees the world. So it moves things to the top. Now, the thing you've got to watch out for this. For example, I had an issue just yesterday with Firefox 10, and Firefox 10 is a bug here. It actually, if you have an inline function like this, and you use it here, you'll actually get foo will be undefined, and that's a bug. It's not supposed to do that. So the idea here is it's all about moving the function declarations to the top of the file, and moving function definitions also to the top of the file, and then of course everything else kind of flows from there. So that's an important thing to remember, and please remember. Now you will see if you run tools like JSLint and these kind of JavaScript cleanup tools, they all encourage as a best practice, right, is to go ahead and declare all your variables at the top of, when you're writing code that is, declare your variables at the top of the function and then initialize them. And this is a little bit different because, traditional good coding practice says, locality is good and you should initialize your variables at the site of their use. And that generally holds true. Well, with JavaScript, that's not the case. So good practice is to declare them at the top of the function. And, inline functions like this, while acceptable, sometimes are not ideal. It's better to declare a variable function at the top and then initialize it. But that's not illegal. I actually do it quite a lot, declare inline, because I find sometimes it's easier to write code that way. Right, so that's talking a little bit about scope. And so I hope that is clear. And I guess take a little bit longer than 5 minutes, but that's okay. I just wanted to, and if you're saying, well, okay, move on now, we get this. The reason I'm saying this is important because the code samples I'm going to show you a little bit later, I'm going to leverage all these pieces, and your old habits will kick in. Some of you will say, well, that doesn't make sense, and then I'm going to say, well, remember what I said about the scope of the function. So let's talk a little bit about functions as well. So in JavaScript, let's take C#, right? C#, functions are not first-class objects. They just aren't. Classes are, right? And classes have functions or methods, whatever you want to call it. You can have statics. And I know in the CLR internally you can do all sorts of wonderful things, right? But in C# you can't. So if I have, let me bring this back here. Let me just leverage this. In C#, and if some of you out there on C# or your C++ or your Python or PHP people, bear with me. I'm just I'm trying to use a language here. If you're a Java person, I'm just trying to use kind of touch points from a language which a lot of people are familiar with, and it helps it. So if I have a public class in C#, right, I can have a function, right? And then I'm going to, var up an instance, right? And then I'm going to say instance dot bar and invoke my function. All right, that's the general thing. We all know that, right? This is one-on-one stuff. However, in JavaScript, you shouldn't think of functions in the way that you think of C#. Probably a good way to think of a JavaScript function in C# is a let's call it a func object. A func object can be newed up because I can assign it things. I can give it a lambda expression, right, where it takes a P effectively, and it returns an R. I mean, I'm kind of abbreviating it just for comprehension's sake. But this lambda expression, I can pass around as a variable. For example, I could call instance dot bar and actually pass in a func. All right, it's a behavior, it's a defined procedure, it's a lambda expression. So that's if you think of JavaScript functions and you're trying to connect it to sort of something that you're more familiar with, probably a func or an action. And again, I'm sorry if you don't know C#, but these are just ways of defining lambdas in C# and abstracting out behaviors. I could, if I did this, right? Let's just call it a behavior. Right? That's an overloaded term in our industry, but nevertheless, you get the gist of it, right? And then, if I was using it, I could actually invoke it, all right, and pass it some data, whatever. So, when you think of JavaScript, you want to think along those lines. You want to think of this behavior that's portable, that's not necessarily it's not necessarily attached to a class or a scope like that. And that's the point I want to make with a function, and I'll delve into this in a moment more. But so in C#, right, I always say, anything you can do, I can do better. This is in JavaScript. Functions are first class. They are way nicer than functions in C#, in my opinion, because they are very, very powerful and very expressive. In C#, I can't do these things, right? But let me show you what I can do in JavaScript, which I can't do in C#. Imagine I had this func, or let's say I had a delegate. Or no, let's take the func. I could actually do this. I can do this in JavaScript. I can say func dot I can add a function as a property to a function. And that's weird. So in JavaScript, you can do things like that. So I could do this. let's say, whoopee. Okay, so what? So do you know that I can do this? Pretty cool. So what? So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that functions can have properties, because functions are objects in JavaScript, and objects can have state. They can have stuff that's outside, over and above their defined behavior. And so that's very helpful to know. It's very, very useful, especially when you're trying to do some dynamic behaviors in JavaScript. And realizing that functions can have properties is real helpful, especially when it comes to patterns and you want to attach state and metadata and meta information to a function that you can then query when it invokes. It's very powerful and very handy. So, important thing to remember there. Right? Let me just get down. Right, so that's all I'm saying here. Functions are objects. So, right, so those are a couple of the basics of the language. Now, let's talk a little bit about a couple of libraries and third-party stuff. And look, there's a lot more to cover in JavaScript. And, you know, if you want to get some good books out there, there's JavaScript Patterns by Stoyan Stefanov. There's JavaScript, The Good Parts, Bad Parts by what's his name? I should know his name. Go look, Amazon, JavaScript, The Good Parts, The Bad Parts. That's right. So great stuff there. Read that. It'll flip your mind, okay? It'll really help you to embrace this language. Very powerful. Now, I'm not saying JavaScript is for everything. It isn't, right? I mean, use the right tool for the right job. But what I will say is that most people don't get JavaScript. This is not your daddy's JavaScript. This has got tremendous powers. It will give you superpowers. So let's talk about deferred. What is deferred? I'm sure all of you have heard of jQuery. So I think if you haven't, you've been living under a rock somewhere. But nevertheless, $deferred is a method in JavaScript that allows you to do asynchronous stuff in a really nice way. It provides a very powerful abstraction built on the idea of promises. And a JavaScript promise is this idea that when you invoke a function and it returns a promise, the idea is the function's returning a commitment to execute that function, and it'll do it sometime in the future, and when it's done, it'll kind of let you know. And deferred is a way to expose that functionality. So think of it in this way. So I promise to do something. This is the function speaking if he were a person. It says, I promise to do something. I'll call you when I'm done. I'm a courier of the behavior that you requested. I'm going to go out and do it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this token. I'm going to give you this object. Okay? And if you write your number on, and you write your number on this object, after I give it back to you, you write your number. When I'm done, this object will invoke that number and call you. So you don't have to put your number on there now. I'm going to give you an object that you put your number on. And if you put your number on, when I'm done, I'm going to attempt to call you. And if your number's on there, I'm going to call you. I hope that makes sense. That may sound, as I'm saying that probably sounds a little convoluted, but nevertheless, let's explore this a little bit more. So think of it like this. I've got a function, and let's call him a long-running function. All right? So here's the problem. So now I've got a client, a consumer of this function, and does not want to wait. So for me, so now here's the problem. So let's say this goes off and does some stuff, and it blocks. It waits around until it's done, because it takes a really long time to do. Well, the problem is that that has a chain effect, right? That the caller of that function is going to have to wait around. Now, in the past, you could do something like this, right? You could say on done, and what you would do is you'd say if right, so that's just your classic callback, and then you'd say, okay, well, you could tell the person is, okay, listen, just call me when you're done, or, you know, all right, is that right? Call me. All right, so, and in this case, it'll go ahead and it'll do its stuff and it'll call you. All right, and that's fine. I mean, you can do that. The problem is now is what if that begins to change? So what if you, in order for this to get stuff done, it has to, you know, so now we've got to pass in another callback, right? So that see what I'm doing? So I do some other long-running function. When I'm done with that, then it calls this callback, which then goes in turn calls this callback. And the bottom line is it gets messy. You know, you start having these nested functions and callbacks, and it's like, yeah, we don't want that. That's just annoying. It really is, and especially when you have, you know, complicated systems where you like in patterns where you've got all sorts of stuff flying around. I mean, it's like a war zone. You get in there and there's just functions and callbacks flying over. You're like, I don't know where I am. I don't know what my context is. I don't know what the stack is. I just know there's callback functions happening everywhere, and I'm not enjoying writing for that environment. Well, promises are just a way to try and make that a little bit easier. The way that we would do that in promises is instead of returning and passing in a function, you use $deferred. And you return it. All right, now I'll explain this now. Now, some of you are saying, whoa, no, that's not quite. You've got to still a promise on, and yes, I'll get there for a moment. So what this is going to do is do what you ask of me. Now this will kind of make sense in a moment. And you're like, where are you going with this? I'm saying, walk with me here. I'm going to show you how this all fits in with patterns and stuff. Because these things are all just mechanisms to make your life a lot easier. All right, so what's going to happen here is when I invoke this function, long-running function, instead of having to pass a callback, I can do that. And as I say, you could do it that approach. It's fine. You know, whatever floats your boat there. That's. But there are easier ways to do things. So a nicer way to do this is because it's returning a promise. This guy here, I can just do this. And if something failed, I could do this. And so these will be the results of the long-running function. And you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So these methods can be chained. Yes, they can be chained, and that's the idea behind it. So the idea behind the promise is that you can add and you can chain on lots of done events. So you could chain another done. Right, so let's say it was some other, so you needed to notify two things together. Now, and there's two different callback scenarios. Now I don't have to write all sorts of special code and ifs and case statements. I don't have to pass in, callback 1 / callback 2 / callback 3 callback n, which just results in enormously painful code. I can use this idea of a promise. And the way that you do this deferred instantiates one of these promise objects. And then it calls a function passing itself in. And I'll explain this in a moment. And then to resolve, to say that this promise is done, all that you do is this. You'd say .resolve. And you can put in some result here. So to consume that, I could look, and I could just do this. I can consume that message when it's done. Now let's say it failed. Then you call the word reject. All right? So what I've done now is the one is resolved, the other is reject. And obviously I'm going to have code here. Hey, something went foobar. All right? And this one is all is.
So that utility is mapping. It's taking that DOM. Yeah, exactly. But well, actually, programmatically, you're.
Hey guys. So all is well and all is done, right? And in this case, I'm saying something's rejected, and what that's going to happen when I reject it, it's going to land up in this block of code. All right, and this is something went bad. Make sense? So what this allows us to do is to do asynchronous stuff. Now, if you use jQuery, let's say you do $get on jQuery. If you're doing REST type calls, and you do a $.get, and you pass a URL, all right? Do you know that get returns a promise? So you could actually do this. And that will be the result of that get. So whatever the contents of that URL will come back. So jQuery extensively uses this deferred and these promises mechanism. Now, I actually returned a deferred here, and normally what you do is you would say promise. And the only difference between, premise versus promise, right? The premise is to promise. When you return a promise method, what it's really doing is returning a scaled down version of the deferred where the consumer cannot change the result. So if I just return, if I don't return promise, I can actually do this. I can take the promise, which came back here, and I can resolve it outside of the calling context. And sometimes you may want to do that if you're chaining calls, but typically you don't. By returning a promise, right, it's not going to allow you to change the state, only to consume it. And so I hope that makes sense. So that delves a little bit into the idea of deferreds. And it's incredibly useful, especially when, because we know when we're doing client stuff, right? This is all for HTML and client-side apps and doing JavaScript. If you have a good mechanism to do asynchronous calls and callbacks and deferreds and stuff like that, it simplifies the code, making it a lot more readable. All right, so that's deferred. That did take a little bit longer. So to sum up with that, promises model future or asynchronous actions, and promises offer a composition and encapsulation to simplify synchronous programming. There's some great information here on promises, and you'll see it. I won't say it's new because it's been around a while, but it's not. People don't realize this mainstream that you can do this stuff. And I'm telling you, if you adopt this way of programming, the amount of code you write in JavaScript will, number one, it'll reduce in size dramatically, because you can express powerful ideas and concepts with very simple mechanisms. Right, so that's deferred. So another stuff I want to just talk about is a library called Amplify. Now, when we think of patterns, I'm sure some of you have heard the idea of a publish and subscribe pattern. And what a publish-subscribe pattern is it's a loosely coupled way of linking systems. So if you have a subscriber, and let's contrast that to an event or a callback, right? If you have a callback like here, let's take this stuff out. If you have a callback, and your callback is there, what's going to happen here if this callback doesn't exist, when I invoke it, obviously it's going to throw an exception because it's undefined, right? They're tightly coupled. That's what it means, right? This has to exist. But what if I wanted to sometime in the future create this callback and have him call back? Well, that's where publish subscribe would come into play. Is that I could do something like this. Assuming I could do something like this. Pub sub mechanism. It's just, okay, bear with me, I'm not the greatest typer, okay? So subscribe. And I say, hey, subscribe me to, let's say, call me. And what I want to happen is when call me is published, all right, then what I want to happen is callback. All right? And let's say some parameters were passed in there. Oh, no wonder, I pressed insert. That's why I'm having a little bit of strangeness here. So, in this way, if I could subscribe, then I could do something like this, right? Number one is I don't have to pass it in. So that means I don't have to have a reference. I don't have to have a JavaScript file that's loaded and some function defined somewhere. I could just do this. And pass in some forms. And I guess I could. So what happens now is that this might be in one file, or one functional closure, one context, if you will, and this would be another. Call it another scope. One scope, another scope, and the scope might be something like a function. Remember, because now we're talking about scoping things, all right? Let's just call it scope 2. So now you can see, because of what I said earlier on about scoping and hoisting and that sort of thing, these functions can't see each other. So what we're basically talking about here is a way, think of it like as an intra-scope communication, right? If I had some mechanism like this where I could publish these messages and subscribe to these messages, I could communicate between these two scopes without requiring them to be loaded into one big file. And the reason why this plays a big role and why I'm leaning towards this is when it comes to modularization, it's huge. Modularization is absolutely huge because it helps you to decompose your application into small manageable blocks. But the problem that you have with that is we all know, right? If you have a small JavaScript file, your only real solution is to bundle all those files up into one big file and then you download it as one. Well, actually, there are ways to around that, and I'll talk about that later, but normally that's the practice. And so you bundle all these files up together, and that's, you like debugging, and it's like freaking 200,000 lines of code. It's awful. It's horrible to debug that stuff. It's hard to edit, because what if you've got like 10 developers, right, and they're all working on the same file? And I was like, okay, well, who checked in last? I did. No, well, you missed, you broke this, you broke. I'm like, oh, please. You know, let's stop the insanity. Let's think about this a little bit more smart. And you'll find, I mean, in general, and I'm generalizing here, when I talk to people about the things that they hate about JavaScript, it's this kind of stuff. It's like, why does it have to be so hard? Well, it doesn't. You just have to let go. As I said, it's like falling out of a tree, right? Just let go. Embrace. Use the force. So this is a scope. So the idea behind the pub sub, I'm turning out to be more long-winded than I realized, but so bear with me. I will try and get to the point. The point that I'm trying to make here is, what was my point? Pub sub. Thank you. So pub sub is a mechanism to do this kind of stuff, and well, Amplify does just that. If you go to Amplify.js, it has exactly this API, except it says Amplify. Amplify. And what's really cool is on a page or on a JavaScript page or in an application, right, because it's running, it's all in memory, you can pub sub messages between each other, between different contexts, and it works like a dream. Now, the downside, of course, is let's not flood the system with messages, because we're starting to talk towards a messaging-based paradigm of development, where you're sending messages like here, as opposed to invoking events. And they both have their pros and cons and their goods and bads. So, you know, you have to make these judicious calls. But if you know these mechanisms are out there, it really is helpful, right? So that delves into the Amplify as a publish, subscribe mechanism. As I say, it facilitates loose coupling in JavaScript. So it's really powerful. Go and have a look at that stuff. All right, so let's talk about another thing here. I've kind of been leading to this point of, you know, we've spoken about scope, we've spoken about functions, and we've spoken about hoisting, when things live and when things die. And now we've got these different scopes of things. So the question arises is, okay, that's all very well, but how do I practically use this stuff and decompose my application, my web application, into some logical way where I can have these small modules and I have some mechanism which brings it all together without me going insane. And this is where Require.js comes in. Require.js is a modularization asynchronous script loader. All right, and what is that? That sounds like a lot. Well, what it is if you need a file, I guess the best way I can think of it is this way. If you were in C# and you had a dependency injection container like Unity or there's like tons of them out there, but you know, one of the dependency injection containers, why can't I think of one? That's sad. I mean, there's too much in JavaScript. But I would do this, right? I would say class, I'd say some constructor, my, well, let's just call it, let me think of something. Let's call it body. All right. And I'm going to have a public constructor, body. But body needs a heart. right? Now, I could go and just do this internally, right? Why do I keep pressing insert? I could do this, and I could say, you know, okay, whoopee. I found my dad. Sorry, I'm behaving like a moron here. So, I'm not thinking. That's fine. I mean, you could do that in cases that make sense. So when I new up a body, right, a heart gets newed up, right? So we can have some heart here, and we can have some soul, we can have some feeling, we can have life. We're not just empty, but I do this. But the problem is, what if I want to interchange my heart, or want to pull in a stronger heart, or maybe there's a heart? Well, dependency injection says, well, that's cool, you just do this. And let's just call it H. And when it's created, you just say H. All right, and then you pass in, when you create a body, you pass in a heart. So when I new up a body, I pass in a new heart. Right, I could do that. And that's fine. And so in that way, you can decompose your system into smaller pieces, right? And you can decide at runtime which one to interchange. Well, what the dependency injection framework does that for you, it does that automatically, right? Typically, you'd say, if it was a container, you would say resolve, and then you would say something like this, body. All right. And what this container does is he goes and he looks at the definition of body, and he looks at the construct, and he says, body needs a heart, and then he goes and creates a heart, and he injects it directly into the body. So when you get a body, you have heart, right? And that's a good thing, because then you're alive, and that's why dependency injection is really cool. Well, Require.js is kind of like JavaScript dependency injection, except that whereas a dependency injection container injects classes and dependencies, Require.js injects modules, which are functions. Remember, functions are first-class objects, so don't get out of shape here. That's what it does. And the way that it does that is it uses the define statement. This would be the behavior, which would be defined. Remember what I said about a function being a scope? This is a thing called an anonymous function. You can call it something if you want it. Let's just call it body. It's just to follow on the theme that I was talking about now. So what this is going to do is when this fires off, and I'll explain this statement now in a moment, this body is going to execute and stuff's going to execute here. But what Require.js allows you to do is to define dependencies. Before that, you put an array, and you put the path of some dependency. And what it does is that in the constructor of this is it passes in the instance of whatever that function was. So now, and let's call this heart. Right. So now I can use heart. I can see beat. All right. And it does this. Now here's the cool thing. If this heart function is defined in another file using this statement, I beg your pardon. Now I can say return heart, and I can give it right? But he may in turn have a dependency on blood. Sorry to be so gory, everyone. It's just what came to mind. So, all right, and in this case, I could as blood, jet, oxygen, whatever. Right. So what I can do is Require.js is I can have this in .js file. And I can have this in body.js. And this define statement is a part of Require.js. What it does is it goes out and it loads these files dynamically from the server, loads those JavaScript files, initializes them, and passes in whatever that was defined to return. So like in this case, this define statement was defined to return just a simple JSON literal with the heartbeat function, right? And so I can invoke it. But supposing I returned a function, let's just say, right? Then I could do this. I could just invoke it because I'm returning a function. Or I could return, I could declare some private variables I could do that. And in this case, I would get oxygen over here. So it's a way to kind of build up the dependency tree of all these modules. So when you think of your class and your functionality, you break it up into these small modules. And I'm going to get into the asynchronous modularization pattern now. But what Require.js does for you is it takes care of a lot of that stuff for you. And so it's really, 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 really helpful. Right, so that's Require.js. So that's something really useful. And then this part, I just want to delve in just to self-executing functions, because this is the pattern. Now we're going to start digging a little more into the pattern stuff. So again, we have a function, right? This is the scope. Okay. Right. Foo lives in the scope of bar. Right? That's great. Now, what you can do is a self-executing function says, hey, take this whole thing, all right, and execute it. Let's say this was, I can invoke it immediately. So what's going to happen here is that this function is going to self-execute. All right, it's going to invoke itself. And I think this is typo. I may have made a mistake. So, right, so I can self-execute in that way, and that's what you call a self-executing function. And you have the reason why you put the round braces is because it has to be an expression. So this is what a self-executing function is, and it's the great way to define a module pattern, because everything that's in here is defined in scope to that. Now what you saw is something similar with the Require.js, and you saw that the Require.js has this scope, but it's a defined, and this is commonly called a sandbox, because it allows you to pull in dependencies, and it keeps everything in here that you're working in there. So there's the modularization or module pattern, and you could do this as well. Is you could say, there, of course, you can invoke it. So you could define it in these ways. So these are just things that I want you to be aware of in terms of modularization, and that's what the self-executing function is it's this idea of I declare a function, an anonymous function, I put parameter, and then I pass it in, and then it immediately executes. All right. So just to cover here, we've covered the model dependency, we've covered some Require.js, and I said they expose these two functions, allow us to pull dependency between each other. So these are some of the building blocks of building modular systems. And if you go look at some of the URL that I've got here, you'll see that there's some really good information on the module pattern, which I've just gone about. But this is a very important piece of you breaking up your code in a way that's really useful. If you don't do this, your JavaScript just tends to be just one big file or several big files, and that can be really, really bad. So another tool I just want to sort of briefly cover, but this is just a boatload of functions. It's called _JS, and _JS is to JavaScript kind of like what the CLR is to C#. It's a whole lot of utility functions and stuff that you can do, useful stuff that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. At least the library, the standard library. So it offers things like to check if it's a function or if it's an array or to enumerate. Now jQuery has also some of these capabilities in it, right? But underscore is just a great, it's widely used. It's very, very powerful. So I'm not going to go into ready state, but just to point out that when we load scripts in JavaScript, that there's a cycle that goes on from getting them from the server, and you don't know when it's going to come back. And that's why the idea of the asynchronous module is really important, because promises allow you to say, well, I'm going to defer making a decision on this until I get the stuff from the server, and this is where deferred really plays its role. So this asynchronous stuff is a big deal. Another useful tool is, like if you want to do like an MVC type paradigm in your code, is to look at Backbone. Backbone is a simple collection of way of abstracting out models and collections and views to follow an MVC type pattern. And it's really, really helpful. The example that I'm going to run in the end here just uses Backbone as an example of how we wire it up. So let's do this. Let's make this happen. So I've covered up some of these sort of useful tools and some of the patterns. I want to go into just one or two more patterns, and then we're going to do a demo. And I think at that point we're getting to a point where we can maybe start being more available for questions and so forth. So let's have a look at something here. So just something to bear in mind here. Suppose I have a defined function. I just want to deal a little bit with assuming we have a defined function, a Require.js function. And what I want to do is when that module is loaded, I want to return a singleton. How can I do that? Well, we know if I say all right. By the way, the casing, uppercase means it's a type, lowercase or camel casing means typically it's an instant. That's just a good JavaScript convention. So if I'm consuming this and I say define, and I take a dependency on the body module, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that capital B, because we're importing it as a function, right? Then what I can say is I can say var body instance equals new body, right? Great. And so, I can call methods and do things. But now what if I want to make sure that only a single instance came back? Well, I could do things like this. I could say in this case, Now I'm returning an instance, so I don't have to new it up here. I can just invoke it, you know. Right, if assuming there was I'm doing this. There's a number of ways to do this stuff, but I'm just trying to simplify for the sake of speed now. Let's just say this was what I was doing, right? So by doing this, I could return an instance of a body, but this is the thing I want you to bear in mind here. What this does is it say, hey, body, give me the body that exists. If it doesn't exist, then give me a new body. And if it does exist, just give me the existing body. It's very much like C#'s coalesce operator. So you want to think of it that way, and that's sometimes a good way, because the reason why this works is because I've declared a closure here, all right? And this closure is defined once. So once this is instantiated, I can just return it, and it'll always return the right instance, all right? But what I could also do is, let's say I wanted to expose a factory. I could do this. Remember what I said. So let's go return back to the big body, all right? Let's just do that. Because functions are first-class objects, I can do this. Now, all the details of how that body is created, remember, this body is different to that one because it's got its own functional scope. All right. Now, I return body, but in this case now, what I do is this. I say body kind of weird, isn't it? All right. Yeah. I know I'm probably getting there are probably some guys out there who are finding some mistakes in what I'm doing, and that's quite reasonable, because there are a number of ways I can do this, and there's a few little detail flaws in some of the things I'm doing, but I'm just trying to illustrate a point to you. You can kind of dig into all the side effects and the different ways of how you hide information. You know, there's that book, JavaScript Patterns, by Stoyan Stefanov. It's kind of delves into some of the subtleties, because what I'm doing here will work, but there's some cases where you might not want things. You may not want, you know, what if I new up the body now? What happens? There's those sorts of things. But I'm trying to point out to you what's different here is I returned a function that has a function. And I use that as a factory in the scope of a module. So now I could pass in parameters, and I could keep everything that defines that body private to the scope of this module. And that's very powerful, because when you're encapsulating other libraries, let's say you're bringing in a JavaScript library from another package, you may want to just kind of keep it isolated from the rest of your system, because you don't want to take a direct dependency in the rest of your code. And so by using a module like this, you can put all that functionality in this module, and if you then decide to switch out to another package, you can replace it, and you replace this module, and all your code will still work, because what you've effectively done is you're sort of adopting a sort of a design by contract approach. So that's really helpful. So this is just, you know, some of the instances, some instancing control here, some factory behaviors. We've dealt with the modular pattern of how you isolate things and make it sort of limited in scope to the function, the containing function. I'm thinking that that's probably about where I'm going to have to just run the example app that I'm showing you, just kind of put this all in perspective. We've been going now for a good while, for an hour and 17 minutes. So I've realized it takes quite a bit more time to delve into more detail, but I hope you find it useful. I will say this, that JavaScript is just, it's really amazing when you start thinking functionally as opposed to, you know, your traditional typing. You can do some pretty powerful stuff. Now, can you shoot yourself in the foot? Of course. Can you make everyone's life miserable and hell? Absolutely. Don't do that. You know, follow good practices. Go on the web. There's lots of great information on how JavaScript is. You see JavaScript being used for applications on Windows 8 now. You know, yes, there's YAML and there's C# and there's C++, but JavaScript is really, it's a full deal. You've got Node.js. So by learning these patterns and understanding the language, there's one thing I didn't touch on in the language, but do you know that JavaScript has a thing called truthy and falsy? I kid you not. It's kind of like, it's not really true, it's truthy. So there's something to chew on. There's some funky stuff out there that will make your code behave in ways that you don't expect. Another thing is, you know, when you do assignments of values, you know, you've got, and let's say there were some values. If you want to compare them exact, you need to do things like that. This will do type coercion. There's little tricks like that that don't apply to C#. So be careful. Don't take those things that always work in C#. Don't always work the same in JavaScript. But it doesn't mean that JavaScript is bad. It's just got its own conventions and its own good ways of achieving things. And the things in JavaScript that you'll be able to do that you will just not be able to do in C# without more code. So there's real value in both. And of course, use the right tool for the right job. I mean, I'm assuming that. My goal here is to just point you out that there are some really powerful things here. So let's look at a Visual Studio project where I've tried to sort of tie some of these things together. So what I've done here is I've just taken an empty MVC4 project, right? A vanilla MVC4 project. And I've added the default page, and I brought in some of these libraries. All right. You can see I brought in Modernizer, jQuery, Bootstrap, Underscore, which we've covered, Require, Backbone, and Amplify. And what I've done is I've shown here how you can bootstrap these dependencies. Now notice the scripts which I have dependencies on in this file are just these. It's just the libraries. Now I've written some bootstrap code here where I've said, let's define the base URL where we're going to load things from as this place. And then let's start pulling stuff in, just like I showed you, that require and that define statement that pulls in the dependencies. Now what I've done is I've said, okay, so now we take our scripts. Look at the scripts folder here. Just do this. So I've got, and I use NuGet to pull on all these packages. So there's a whole lot of libraries there that I've pulled in by NuGet, right? Then I took my script and I broke it up into an app folder. And in this app, I created a bootstrapper. And look at the bootstrapper. The bootstrapper's purpose and goal is purely to load and initialize an application object, which is kind of lives in for the life cycle of this particular page. It's like in a single page application, right? You're going to do something like this, depending on which libraries you use. So he takes a dependency on the application object. Look at my application object. I mean, it's 30 lines of code. It's modular. I'm using subscriptions. I'm pulling in dependencies. I'm doing all these things. I'm exposing some methods and basically initiating a hash change monitor event on this application. Then I said, let's take our router, just like we have a server-side router, and I wish I could delve into this in more detail, but I think we're running short on time here. The router is on Backbone, just as the routing tables are in C# for MVC. You know, if we have a vanilla project and you configure your routes in C#, you're going to define your routes and you define some kind of a pattern, right? And then that's going to kick off the appropriate controller and appropriate action to fire off whatever events. So Backbone has a similar paradigm in its router. You specify a pattern. In this case, I'm just monitoring for the string, and then it's invoking this hash change function. But then I want to publish this event because I don't want router to have a dependency on the application object, because then I have to have a reference to that object. So I can use loose coupling and messaging to publish that message to the application object, which doesn't really, he instantiates a router, but he doesn't know the details. So he instantiates a router, and that's all he does. And then the router takes care of subscribing, and then he subscribes to these messages, and the router publishes these messages. And all that I'm doing in this case is I'm saying if there's a hash change event. And a hash change event is in the browser when you have a URL. You have the hash character. And usually when you load a page in a browser, right, it's going to go out and fetch that whole URL. Well, everything after the hash, if you change that, it doesn't result in a URL load. It tries to go to that index in that document, so to speak. And so what's really cool is that you can tie into when that event changes. So what I'm doing is I'm monitoring for changes in the hash. I'm not actually going to the server, but when that change is happening, I'm using that string to load content from the server. So let me run this. And I think we're going to conclude at this point. Hopefully it'll all work. All right, so what I'm doing, I'm subscribing to messages, and I'm getting a home message. Bear with me, I'm running through this, but I'll illustrate this in a point. And I'm getting that message, and look what's in the browser. See, it's in the browser here. I just have a hash change event, home. I'm subscribing to that, and then I'm saying, okay, let's go out and get that content from the server, which is just a vanilla MVC view. But now I'm using asynchronous promises, and I say, when that's done, all right, then let's put that HTML content in the page. And then after that, let's go and load a view somewhere. Let's put the dependency on the view, and when it comes back, return it and instantiate the view. Right, so here's the content that comes back from the server, and that is just a vanilla. Let me just show you guys what I'm saying. You can see here, here's home. This is just a partial. Here's index, at least inbox. So these are just partials on the server. I'm going to go that and load that content and came back. You see how the syntax? Get this URL. When you're done, take the content and put it into HTML, then load the view and attach the view to that region of the page, all right, and call render. And what that does is this is just like a little single page application. Let me just take these breakpoints off. Come on. So what I'm doing here, right, is I'm going each time to the server and loading that information based on hash changes here. I'm not actually, so I can now have this application object in memory, very much like a single page application. And I can modularize and grow this application. So I can grow this application up because I've got a strategy to modularize the JavaScript. I don't have to change the page every time. Here's my application. Here are my facilities. I can add models and views. You'll see specifically what happens when that view is attached. It literally renders this. Results in this code being rendered. So very powerful. Just again, simple patterns. Now, I've probably gone all afternoon, but I'm pretty much out of time, so that's why I rushed this last piece together. And I'm sorry about that. I thought I would have more time, but I tended to be more long-winded than I thought. But I hope it gives you the idea here that you just got to think about this stuff different, and you can do incredibly powerful things with JavaScript, both on the server and the client. you just think about these objects. You think about functions in a different way. Functions are first-class objects. There's great ways of doing asynchronous things. There's ways to do singletons and factories and command behaviors and all these things. It's totally possible. And you can even do inheritance and prototype inheritance. It's all things. So I hope you enjoyed that. That was really fun. I really hope that you enjoyed it and it was something, you learned something. If I bored you to death, my deepest apologies. I wasn't quite sure of where the audience is. I'm going to try and do some more advanced stuff down in the future where we kind of dig in. I might not make it as broad as this. But thanks very much.
Not boring at all, Mitch. In fact, a very entertaining presentation. Very, very informative. I believe Bethany has some news for you. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to switch to our slides a second so that you can answer your IMs there.
Great.
You're messaging on live meeting.
Yeah, let me see here. All right.
And then we've got a couple of questions there that we can possibly get through just before we wrap up. For those of you who were late to the party, I know a few of you were, I saw some questions come up in our Q&A panel. This presentation will be going on to our YouTube page along with all the rest of our presentations. I can't say how long it'll be or when it'll be because we have to upload it and convert it yet, like we usually do. So the best thing you can do really if you're waiting for us to publish it on YouTube is just watch the LIDNUG Twitter feed at LIDNUG. We generally put it out on there with the link once it's ready. Okay, so have you got your news there yet, Mitch?
I think yes, I've got the views up. I see 3 chat windows here, so I don't see any questions.
This is no. If you look in your instant message window, I think Beth's got the answers for our winner.
Ah, Mark Schneider is the winner
there we
of
go.
the virtual training pass. So, Mark Schneider, you are number 1. Make it so.
Congratulations to you, Mark. If you've got a microphone, we can have a little chat later once we've finished the recording and what have you, and you can come and say good things about LIDNUG. But from that point on now, we've got some Q&As there, Mitch. So if you want to have a quick look through them, is there anything there you want to answer?
I'm seeing here. I'm still not seeing the questions.
Well, we've got Juan. Do you want me to read through them for you?
Yes, I'm sorry. I've got all the IMs open. I'm still not seeing it for some other reason. But yes, you can read it.
This is your Q&A panel. Right, so let's have a look. KAU, have you got any handouts that you can give away?
Yes, so I will make the slides. I will make the slides and the project, the Visual Studio project, available.
Good stuff. So that covers the T's question. Can you publish your demo project? And Vlad, can we get that VS solution? So yes, I'm guessing if you follow Mitch on Twitter, you'll be able to get a link to all those materials.
Yeah. And
right.
Yeah.
So Andre asks, is TypeScript a dynamic or a static language? I think that's been sat in there since nearly the beginning as well.
So TypeScript, I would say, is a gateway. It's a gateway. Look, basically TypeScript, I really like the idea because it allows you to define your intent around JavaScript. But basically, it's JavaScript. What TypeScript is doing is it's added some sugar that are pre-processed, but the output is pure JavaScript. So no, it's not a typed language. It's a way to declare type. But what you actually consume and run is vanilla, pure JavaScript. It is not extending the JavaScript language at all. It is purely making it easier to use and consume and publish. I'm very excited with some of the TypeScript. And I know some people in the JavaScript community are like, this is whatever. I'm like, no, it's great because it helps you to show intention. And wherever you can be intentional in JavaScript, it's probably intentionally good. If you are unintentional, you're usually unintentionally bad. So that's kind of my take on TypeScript. I'm very exciting, and I'm watching that.
Sorry, Andrea's just asking then a follow-up to that previous question. Can we use TypeScript instead of using JavaScript in Windows 8 applications? That's an interesting question, actually.
So let me speak. So I'm not when it comes to JavaScript applications, right? In Windows 8, it's JavaScript. The output of TypeScript is JavaScript, so you can use that. Because what you're going to do is with TypeScript is it's going to help you define your contracts and your libraries so that it's easy to use in Visual Studio. So I haven't done it, but my guess is absolutely you will be able to because it's the output that counts. And that will be able to be consumed in Windows 8. But I'm not like,
Vlad.
Yes.
Sorry, go on.
No, that's it. Go for it.
Vlad and Theron both want to know what your Twitter handle is.
So it's at Metanucia, METANUCIA.
Well, what we can do actually, if we do this, we put a whiteboard up. We can, you can actually type it up on there. I believe.
Let me see. Let me type it.
I think the pen tool's at the bottom there. And there you go, guys. There's Mitch's Twitter handle.
Metanucia, as in minutia.
And since this is still recording, that'll also be on the YouTube video as well.
Awesome.
Right, I think we've got time. I think we've got time for one more question here. When I can do most things with HTML, CSS, JS in a browser, and when I need to talk to the server, I can use web service and get most of things done this way. Why would I need server-side technologies like ASP, MVC web forms? I mean, can you think of some scenarios where I absolutely need server-side tech? So I think what Ritesh is saying is, if I can do all this wonderful stuff with JavaScript and JavaScript-like technologies, why do I need my server-side?
The server serves you. It is your servant. Look, I think it's sometimes the security. If you think of the infrastructure that makes data available, it can make sense to serve up data through a server-side REST endpoints. I personally quite like client-side JavaScript for the rendering of the views and stuff, but I think server-side, there are things that, from a computation perspective and integration into other systems, where you're going to use the server to give you data, and then you can render that data with client-side technologies. Look, you can do a lot in client-side, and I think when you look at HTML5, it's got persistence, it's got a lot of things like that. But I think the security story around HTML5 is still something that's evolving, and so that's something you have to be careful of. But you can do an enormous amount on client-side, and the thing is, what are you trying to do? And those are the questions you need to ask. Because yes, some things maybe you don't need the server, but you know, things like authentication. If you're developing a website for a corporation or something, they've got assets and information inside their firewalls and so forth, and they can't publish all that stuff to this client side. Number one, you're going to overload. There's going to be so much JavaScript to do stuff that you don't want to do. So it all boils around is using the right tool for the right job, and so it's a sliding scale. So I hope that gives you a good answer. It's a difficult question because it depends on what you're trying to do. But I think, to your point, you can do a lot more on the client now with JavaScript if you just think about it differently. But that doesn't, just because you can, doesn't always mean you should. And that would be my answer to that.
Absolutely, and I mean, as somebody who does a lot of web development myself as well, I've wholeheartedly got to agree with that. I'm a very, very big supporter of right tool for the right job. If you need server-side technologies, use them. If you don't use them. Simple as that. The less you've got to contend with, the easier it makes your job as a developer.
Absolutely. And I will say, you know, just to add on, if you think of like in HTML5, things like WebSockets and all these sorts of great abilities to do a lot of concurrent type stuff on the client, that's going to make your JavaScript application so much more powerful. So you really need to learn that. The problem that people have is that HTML5 only takes you up to a point, right? You're going to need JavaScript to take it further. And if you've got a good strategy to break up and decompose that JavaScript, number one is the consumers of your code are going to really like you, because you make it easy to maintain, easy to own, easy to comprehend, which is generally not true of a lot of JavaScript projects out there. It's just a big mishmash of who knows what. And so you want a good way to compartmentalize things. And that's where patterns and these sorts of things comes into play.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap it up there, Mitch. Thanks very much. Fantastic presentation. Hopefully you'll hang around for 5-10 minutes or so and have a bit of a chat off mic once we stop the recording.